Hi, this is Tracey Tokuhama-Espinosa. I want to share with you a very brief synopsis of a very long paper about international indicators of quality education and the influence that economic status, the units of analysis that are chosen, and culture, and how they might possibly influence the choice that different countries make related to indicators that are used to measure quality education. And this has to do with developed countries as well as those that are in the process of development. Before we do this, I want to share a couple of biases that I think are only fair so that you can judge the information for yourself and understand where I'm coming from on this. I subscribe to a teacher, researcher, or teacher practitioner model in which I think that it's really vital that the person sharing research about a teaching or education field should be somebody who's a good researcher, but they also should have experience in the classroom. We just have far too many people who are doing just pure research and haven't stepped foot in the classroom, and then we have people who are in the classroom who don't know enough about research. So I really believe that that's a key model to actually have a good, well-rounded perspective on the information that's presented. And the second point, I'm a big fan of John Hattie and his meta-analysis of 900 meta-analysis of what actually influences student learning outcomes. And I do firmly believe that aside from the student himself and his own perspective on learning, that the teacher and teaching have the greatest influences on student learning outcomes. Which gets to the last point, is that I do believe that the role of formal education is to actually maximize the potential of each learner in our classroom. So those are the biases with which I'm approaching actually this study. So we basically faced a big question, which was which indicators should be used to measure quality in education. So we have had the occasion where it's sort of been thrown out at us and by government officials, tell me what to measure or what is the right thing to measure. And it's a very interesting question, but we decided to actually approach this by breaking down the question into a couple of different pieces. We figured if we had a systematic look at what indicators are already being used to measure quality in education, and then look at which ones are chosen by which countries at what moments in their history, or why they actually do this based on how they've determined priorities, we would have a better global framework from which we can actually approach this question from here on out for any country at any stage of progress in measuring quality in education. In order to do this, our initial approach was to actually use data from the OECD countries, basically because it's very high quality. There's a high level of confidence you can have in the statistics that they share, that they have over 40 years of history actually doing this, gathering data in a comparative sense for international comparison, that it's really accessible, and that also I have the privilege of actually working on one of their expert committees right now related to teachers' new pedagogical knowledge. So they're very forthcoming and sharing a lot of great documents with us. And it's basically looking at some of the most developed countries around the world, which means that there are many different sophisticated ways that they're approaching educational measurement right now, which are valid. On the negative side of it, the 34 countries that are OECD members are only equal to less than 20% of the world's population, and as we said, they are some of the most developed economies in the world, which means that some of the less developed countries around the world may or may not be able to adhere to some of the advice or some of the structures or some of the recommendations or some of the processes that the OECD countries have actually followed. So this means this is something that we actually looked at in the conclusions a great deal, because right now I'm sitting here in Ecuador, and it's a different approach that we might need to take towards the choice of quality indicators in education that a more developed country in the OECD might take. So we started off with this general hypothesis that countries are logical, even though we know that countries don't make decisions, individual people do, but that if there was a logic to this process, then approaching the choice of indicators would be based on clearly identifying objectives. And this follows a backward design concept. Basically, there's only 3 steps in backward design. The first is to decide your objective. What is, for example, the overall goal or the objective of formal education? Why do we teach? Why educate? So what is the purpose? The second stage then would be to choose the indicators. So this means that you shouldn't ever choose indicators before you actually know what you're trying to measure, or what is the goal that you're trying to measure. And then the third stage would be to actually have activities. What do you do? How do you gather the data? What types of policies are put into place? So basically, the reason it's called backward design, although it sounds quite logical, a lot of countries actually go about it the other way around. They have a lot of activities, or they conduct policies, and then they evaluate whether or not the policy worked. In the choice of key quality indicators, we'd like to propose that the framework of using backward design, or actually this mentality or the approach or the planning structure, is far superior. Once you know what you're aiming towards, then you choose the indicators that surround those particular objectives. So if we have to decide the objectives, then this means this would be a perfect model if we could actually articulate what does quality education mean? Because everybody, is striving towards quality education, but very few people find it easy to articulate what it is that they actually want out of quality education. So one of the first steps in our paper was to actually propose different definitions, or to review definitions of what quality education is. And you get a myriad of responses. You get people or countries that focus basically on, how much money is spent on education, or how many kids actually go to school, or whether or not they have high international standardized test scores. But our proposal is that all of these things are important all of the time. However, at different stages of a country's development, they will need to look at different things first, second, third. There should be priorities given to different types of indicators at different stages of economic development. So we tried to create a framework that actually allow that. And one way to do this, which is very, very interesting, is that we found that there are definite floors that have been offered, definite minimum standards that have been promoted by the large international organizations, UNESCO, the Millennium Goals, the Organización de Estados Iberoamericanos. They basically all share the same floors. They basically say that, quality education means universal access to primary education is one of these points. So we know that they all share similar floors. But what's very interesting is that ceilings are very different depending on each country. So while the floors are the same, the ceilings are different. Sometimes floors and ceilings are actually the same thing, because depending on the stage of a country's development, they're striving for the bare minimum to basically say, this is where we're trying to reach right now. So they haven't projected towards higher goals much beyond what is recommended by UNESCO, for example. However, it's very important to recognize that floors and ceilings are not the same thing for OECD countries, which, all 34 countries have basically almost all more than passed all of the basic floors that have been recommended internationally. So their true goal now is, or their true challenge, I guess, is to actually, now that they have the floors, they have to decide what are the priorities as far as ceiling measures. Where do they actually go? So this changes the objective a bit. So depending on a country and its stage of development, you'll have different objectives. Some might be just the minimum standards, trying to reach universal access to education. That would be a minimum for many countries. But those countries, especially the OECD countries that have already passed those minimum objectives, they have to individually now aim towards different types of objectives. So we refined our research question to sort of break it down into these three big areas, right? We realized that there was a great pattern of information that showed that depending on the economic status of a country, there would be a change. So does being rich or being an OECD country change your choice of indicators? Being a poorer or developing country? We looked at that question. We also looked at the choice of units of analysis. So looking at a systems review of a country to judge quality versus looking at individual student learning outcomes or teacher standards or different aspects of your budget. Which level you decide to look at or focus on will also change. We found the way you prioritize your indicators. And then also, historically and culturally, there are different value systems that go along with the choice of indicators, which is a third question that we're looking at in this particular paper. When we try to just sort of settle on what has already been used, or what are the indicators that are used commonly, we found that in Botani's work for the OECD in 1998, he identified 50 key indicators that almost all countries will measure at some stage of development. Sheeran's expanded on this to many more indicators, quadrupling the total number, mainly taking into account a lot of qualitative indicators that hadn't before been given priority. When we tried to eliminate for duplication, we ended up coming up with a total of 217 indicators, which we separated into 11 categories. And these 11 categories were based on two different grand groupings. One things that related to specific policies, and the other that had to do with conditions or circumstances or contexts that were also measured. So we found that all countries at some stage of the game are measuring access or coverage. They're also all measuring equality or equity. They're all measuring things like retention and completion or staying rates in school. They all have things related to standards and academic achievement, to teachers and to teaching, to the evaluation process, to financing, and to governance. These are all policy areas that have indicators that are attached to them. We also found that there are circumstantial things, for example, family and community indicators, as well as things related to culture, legal system, the demographics of a country. So these context things also contribute to the choice of indicators. And we found that different frameworks, we looked at 20 major frameworks over the past 20 years that have been used. And they range from things like Pigosi's concept of trying to center this, basically saying, what is the purpose of education? Well, it's to learn. This focus, our focus was mainly on this particular angle. We had other models like Sharon's, who actually talks about the general context of a country is influenced by the inputs that are chosen, the processes that are undertaken, and then the outcomes that can actually be measured. This was actually a very comprehensive framework that we actually used a great deal in our consideration. And then there's also things, UNICEF has put out this wonderful model that actually replicates a lot of the information that Sharon's had related to considering the process, the content of what's measured, as well as the environment, as well as considering how the learner and teachers all contribute to this concept of quality outcomes. So all of these were taken into consideration. There were 20 different models, and we decided to highlight 4 of them that showed very different ways of contributing towards choice of quality indicators in education. And from those 4 models, we pulled out different types of concepts to build our own framework, which had to do with organizational types, indicator types, either conceptual indicators or pragmatic indicators or policy indicators, or descriptors, whether the indicator is related to inputs or processes or outcomes or contexts, as well as to processes themselves. So whether or not if the model that we're using is focused on goals, or whether it's focused on understanding how our resources are best used, or understanding how to learn from our past mistakes. So different types of model choices, the process of how you go about choosing the indicators was also incorporated, as were distinct mind frames. So basically, if you're looking to choose indicators because you're in a productivity mind frame, or if you want to have a effectiveness mind frame, or if you're trying to adapt to new things, or if you're looking for pushing equity, depending on your mind frame, there's also different choice of indicators that different countries will use depending on where they're at the stages of their progress towards quality in education. So based on that, we came up with our own model that has a lot to do with, taking in information, continually having a new plan. Those things are looking at. Then we look at all the different alternatives that can exist and the consequences that happen as a result of that application. So then we can, we have a hypothesis, we come up with a different design, we implement a plan, and then there's an increase of the scale once a pilot has been done, and then you synthesize and you rethink your overall choice of indicators. So basically, we see that over time, the best countries have gone about approaching this as a thoroughly iterative process that goes back and forth between all of these different stages. And it's a never-ending process. It's not that you can say, okay, we're going to choose the indicators for our country and that's going to be what's settled. We know that some countries, for example, will begin saying, okay, we're looking towards equity. And once they've achieved equity, then they say, okay, now our goal relates to inclusion. So we know that there are higher level goals that will occur throughout a country's historical processes. In order to think about this then, in a continually iterative process throughout a country's history, year by year, as they review, are these the right indicators to be measuring? We posed 7 types of questions that would help reflect on those choices, that would make a country actually rethink and decide for themselves the way to go about approaching the choice of educational indicators. So some countries are just purely looking at product structures. Others are more concerned with improving processes, and others are actually concerned with measuring progress from one year to another. So just by asking a country to think about those stages helps actually prioritize different indicators. We also found that by calling attention to the unit of analysis, whether or not a country has really got policies focused on international comparative indicators, or whether or not they're much more concerned down at a very micro level of analysis of looking at improvements in individual teachers, those things change when policy priorities change. So asking a country to reflect about that is very helpful in actually understanding why they would tend to choose different types of indicators over others. We also found that, and we've made a classification, which I'll share with you in just a second, about certain indicators that appear to be very basic. For example, this concept of universal access to primary school education, or a certain amount of budget, being dedicated towards education. There's certain basic indicators which are very distinct from other high-level indicators. For example, some countries have reached a level of sophistication where they're actually trying to measure the role of, community input into the educational process and planning, and responding, making them mutually responsive to the student learning outcomes. So there's different levels of indicators that can be approached. But one thing that's very, very clear, and actually you can see with some of the less advanced OECD countries as far as their choices are concerned, if you start to aim towards certain indicators or the measurement of certain things, you will inevitably end up being lowest on the scale, number one. But the other thing is that it also means that you may change your policy priorities towards things that aren't realistic. It's kind of like building a house. If you have a weak foundation, poor floors, if you haven't reached those minimum indicators, or minimum standards that are pointing towards educational quality, it really makes no sense to try to build, beautiful windows and ceilings, because, those windows and ceilings might be around there and you can invest a lot into them, but it's not sustainable. It's not a long-term process for actually choosing indicators. So basically, asking countries to reflect. For example, Turkey has a very low per capita income compared to all the other OECD countries, yet they still continue to measure similar things. And when they are asked, what is your per capita investment in tertiary education, they try very hard to push themselves on that level. But the point is, if they haven't even reached, universal compulsory education levels, it's very hard to push yourself towards an indicator that is not reflective of where your country's reality is. So of all of the different questioning activities, this would be one of them that I think is very, very important. And it also is very important for other countries that might be considering, for example, throwing their hat into the ring of different types of international comparative studies when they haven't done other basic things. So we'll share that in more detail in just a minute. There's also a reflection of what type of data has high fidelity or low fidelity. We find that certain things are easily, you can reconfirm them very, very easily. For example, percentage of GDP spent on education is a piece of data that's very quantitative. It's not very hard to you have multiple sources that can reconfirm that data. So those types of things are very easy to measure, and they actually tend to be chosen a lot because they say, there's no doubt about it. Nobody's going to question whether or not we do spend this amount of money. What is less tangible and less high fidelity are data related to, for example, the governance of that money, the good use of that money. Has it been well spent? Those things are far more tricky to measure, but they're far more influential in actually determining quality education. So asking countries to actually have a good reflection about whether or not the type of data that they're choosing and why. People shouldn't just use data because it's easier to measure or gather, which we'll look at in just a minute, or because it's less costly, but rather they should choose indicators that actually help them measure whether or not they're reaching their objectives or what they are calling quality education. Another way to look at this is whether or not there's a high cost or low cost, and at what point are you actually measuring how well your investment is in educational evaluation. Are you using your money in the best way possible? There are some things that cost a lot that give a lot of great information, but then again a country has to decide, is that investment in that single indicator worth the amount of data or information that they're going to have to be able to make future policy decisions based on that. Okay. We also know that there's different types of complexity related to data gathering and indicators. There's some things that are very complex in gathering the data, and other things that are complex in analyzing the data. Some things are easy to gather but hard to analyze, and some things are hard to gather and then easy to analyze. So you really have to have a good reflective process there to understand where actually your resources are actually going to be spent. Some countries choose data that's easy to gather, but then don't realize, because they think that's a low-cost investment, but truthfully it ends up being quite high because the data analysis process takes a lot longer, and vice versa. And the seventh question had to do with, reflecting on the frequency of use. We know that some indicators are only available, for example, you take a PISA test, that's every 3 years. You can have a national test that could be every year if you wanted, or you could look at provincial data, and that could actually be, every semester or every month. So you have to decide with what frequency can you handle the data that's coming in for analysis, but at the same time, what is each indicator actually going to yield? So asking countries to think about these 7 different questions, we realized would create a very strong framework. So our proposal is what we're calling an International Indicators Quality Education Framework, where you will have the categories of indicators as we mentioned here, and you will then consider whether or not those are indicators that are input, process, outcome, or context indicators, as Sharon recommends. Then you consider the specific indicator that exists, and then you ask countries to reflect. Are you considering this to be a product, process, or progress? For example, because all indicators can be all of those things. So it depends, depending on whether or not you consider it a final product, for example, PISA scores. If that's all you're looking at as the final test score, that's a product. If you're considering how students were helped to prepare for that test, that's a process measure. Or if you're considering what your last score was versus your next score, that can be a progress measure. So we know that all of these indicators can be product, process, or progress, but depending on how a country is considering to use that data, will change actually maybe a hierarchy or a prioritizing of whether or not that indicator should be used specifically. Then we ask them to reflect on the unit of analysis, whether or not it's a basic indicator or it's a sophisticated indicator, or if it's more advanced, whether or not it's high fidelity data, the costs involved, whether or not it's complex in data gathering or complex in data analysis, and the frequency. So basically we've plotted, and this is what is on the Excel, is all of the 11 categories of indicators, all of the 217 indicators that exist, and then a suggested ranking or suggested labeling of those different indicators based on these concepts. All of this is totally open for debate. One of the big limitations of our own personal study is that we were doing this based on the OECD data and other specific country information data, but we did not, for example, specifically compare budgets for costing out, how much does it really cost to have integration for physical disability access in each country. These were general estimates based on information that was available at the time. So these are things that are definitely open for debate and for betterment in this particular tool. So the answers to the research questions. In response to the first question, does economic status of a country influence which variables are considered as quality indicators? We have to answer that it does not influence it. We found that the poorer countries, Chile, Mexico, Turkey, it didn't influence. They were measuring the exact same things as the very, very rich countries were measuring. Luxembourg, United States, they were measuring the same things, but the recommendation is that they shouldn't. They should actually take some more time to decide whether or not those exact same things should be measured, because they may be at different stages and need different types of things. So there should be a deeper reflection there about the choice of indicators. Related to the second question, related to the units of analysis, we know that priorities can change, and we mentioned that you can consider PISA, for example, at a macro unit, whether or not we need to change our curriculum, a national curriculum thing, a meso-analysis, or we can do it at a micro-analysis related to teacher preparation. There's lots of ways to analyze the data depending on the lens you're using. So are we using a lens of macro-analysis, use of the data from that indicator, or are we looking at it from a micro-analysis? It's not to say that anything is better or worse than another. It's just that if you don't think about that, it's very, very hard to maximize the potential use of the data that you have, and it will lead to different outcomes. You can basically say that, yes, we were highly successful in showing, for example, Chile can say they're highly successful in showing, they made quite a lot of progress related to preparing students, at a micro level for the test. But can they actually say that the policy that was applied to get there actually justified the end product there? So you have to have a deep reflection there about the unit of analysis. So we say that There's two ways that the unit of analysis can actually influence outcomes. One way is through the selection, and then the other, because that's a reflection of the priorities that are given to certain policies, and then actually the usage of the data in the end. So we know that it is used, but sometimes it's not used to its potential. It's the unit of analysis isn't reflected upon nearly enough to actually yield the best use of all the data possible. Then finally, to the third question, how does culture and historical variables, how does that influence the choice of indicators? In choosing the indicators, there's almost no evidence that there's a cultural influence in that. However, in the analysis of the data that was gathered, there's no way of escaping it. There is no cultural-free indicator that exists in measuring education. So the answer is kind of mixed. We know that it's not usually an influence in the choice of indicators, but that it cannot help but be influential when you're analyzing the data that's yielded from those indicators. So what does this mean? We know that the economic status of a country can influence indicator choice, and that unit of analysis can influence choice, and that culture does influence choice. So therefore, what we would suggest then is that there is an overall global vision before choosing indicators, that before countries launch into this process, we should consider the floors before the ceilings. So, there are some basic things that have to be done before you can go on to advanced indicators. That each country is going to be unique. It's not like here's the recipe, go ahead and bake your cake, but that the fact that here I'm giving you a bunch of different ingredients and you're all going to come out with something totally different. It's all going to end up differently. So you have to sort of take this as there's no set pattern or set way, and nobody should tell any specific country, use these indicators, because it worked for our neighboring country. That doesn't mean it's going to work for you, because it may be that you have different policy priorities in mind. Another very key finding was that high expenditure does not guarantee high quality data. So you can spend a lot on educational evaluation. It doesn't mean that you're leveraging the information that you have to the best ability. Complexity should not discourage selection. Some of the most complex indicators, for example, teacher observation of classroom management or something like that costs a lot to do. However, the results can actually yield the best information for making policy changes that actually do influence student learning outcomes more than other things could. For example, counting how many school buildings we have. All countries need to decide whether or not they're measuring products or process or progress before they embark on this indicator choice, or at least understand how they're using the data and whether or not that's actually maximizing the potential of the data that they have. And that the unit of choice should be well reflected upon. And one of the problems that a UNICEF study found that in our study that we were reviewing is that the unit of analysis tends to be on institutional focus as opposed to individual kids and their learning outcomes. As I mentioned before, I have a very heavy bias towards the idea that education is to educate, maximize the potential of every single individual kid, not necessarily to say, whether a country has better test scores than another country, or whether or not at an international comparative level, I'm not sure how well that's actually going to inform a country about how to maximize the potential of each of its citizens' use of the educational system and to yield high-quality education. So, in the end, summary of the process, what we would recommend is that there's a consensus on objectives, and believe it or not, that's probably the biggest stumbling point. When we talk about backward design, you have to know your objective first. And it's very, very hard for many countries to articulate what does quality education mean. The second point would be to accept that there's not going to be any recipe and that it is hard work and that each country has to actually approach all of these things. They're going to have to combine these indicators in different ways, in distinct ways. Given their budgets for evaluation, they have to prioritize. Nobody can, nor would they want to, evaluate 217 different indicators on a yearly basis. You'll have to choose based on different priorities that you have. And then finally, review all of the different indicators that might exist, for example, the ones that are in this Excel that are listed or are grouped in this way, and then choose the indicators based on how successfully they help you measure your objective. So what it is that you've decided is quality education. If to you quality means equity, then that means that allowing all kids to reach all levels of education should be the indicators that you're going to look at. So access, staying rate, retention, those types of things would be high quality. But if your other goal, you might have other goals that you're looking to help be sure that all kids, independent of whatever intellectual abilities they might be born with, that they can maximize their potential, well, then you'll be looking at other indicators, perhaps like Finland looks at, which has a very big program related to remediation activities so that no kid fails. So we have to look and, there's different choices made based on different priorities for different countries, based on the different values that each country has. The final thing is that this is not like we figured it out. It's an ongoing, never-ending, iterative and reflective process that will happen every single year, or even with more frequency if possible. But the idea is that this is something that this is going to change based on every government and every government's priority. So, and it could change with every Minister of Education that changes. So all of these things have to be taken into account. The one thing that should be remembered is that this particular framework is thrown out there as a possible way of not forgetting to reflect upon certain key areas that really do tend to influence how different countries will make those choices about key indicators. So it's not prescribing what should be done. It's not saying these are most important or less important indicators. It's saying that at least these levels of reflection are very, very important in order to guarantee that each country is making the best choices it can for itself based on its particular policy needs at the time. With that, I close, and just to say thank you very much for your attention on this, and I hope that if there's any questions or anything that we could provide as far as further information, or if you do want to see the full paper, please don't hesitate to contact us. Thank you very much.